Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We'll just start this webinar in 2 minutes. I'm just waiting for all the participants to come inside first. Thank you. Right, so I think we can get started. So thank you everyone for coming to this webinar, and thank you Taylor's Business School for organizing it. So just a gentle reminder for everyone, please make sure that your mics are on mute, and if there will be a Q&A session immediately following this webinar. So if you guys have any questions in the meanwhile, please make sure that you type it in the chat box. And after the presentation in itself, I will take everyone's question and answers. So I will try to finish everything in about 40 minutes or so. So we have about 20 to 15 minutes for the Q&A session in itself. So I guess we can get started. So this webinar is on the behavioral economics of retirement preparedness. And this project was supervised by Associate Professor Dr. Saif Ali Sharif and Associate Professor Dr. Ratnaswari Rasaya. So this actually formed my part of my thesis. So a little about me. I just finished my PhD from Taylor's University, and my topic was in behavioral economics and its application to retirement preparedness specifically. So we thought it was a good idea to organize this webinar in itself so that people learn about how Taylor's University incorporates behavioral insights. Moving on, so just a brief outline about this webinar. So I've divided this into three parts, part A, B, and C. So part A, I will talk about the relevance of financial literacy for retirement preparedness. So in the beginning, I'll just give some definitions about financial literacy and retirement preparedness. So there are different ways that researchers conceptualize financial literacy and retirement preparedness, but I'll just give a brief overview about it. And then I will talk about how does financial literacy in itself contribute to retirement preparedness, followed by the limitations of financial literacy. So when I talk about the limitations of financial literacy, I will basically talk from a theoretical perspective of how financial literacy contributes to retirement preparedness. And then I will talk about a more realistic perspective of the limitations of financial literacy. So part B, I will move on to the behavioral economics of retirement preparedness. I'll talk about what is behavioral economics in itself and why should we even apply it to retirement preparedness, and how do these insights then contribute to attaining retirement security, retirement readiness, or retirement preparedness. Actually, all these terms are interchangeable, they mean the same thing. And then part C, I will move on to our research, the research at Taylor's University, the project in itself that I'm talking about, and how did we apply behavioral insights to the Malaysian retirement market, and why did we even apply it to begin with. So in this, I will talk about the current state of knowledge, sorry, the current state of retirement preparedness in Malaysia and the current financial literacy levels, which is why we needed to apply behavioral insights to begin with. So the outcomes, again, is to learn about the limitations of financial literacy in promoting retirement preparedness and why both behavioral interventions and insights, as well as financial literacy, are crucial for retirement preparedness. So actually the words behavioral insights and interventions, they're actually synonymous to one another because behavioral economics is very much interventionist driven field. So when you talk about insights, you're technically talking about designing interventions in itself. So moving on to part A, the relevance of financial literacy for retirement preparedness. So there are different ways of conceptualizing retirement preparedness. Like I said, that it's synonymous to saying retirement security or retirement readiness. But the important point is that retirement preparedness does not happen overnight. It's a long process that happens over the entire life of one person's entire life. So retirement preparedness can be conceptualized as relevant behaviors and psychological processes that are necessitated to maintain a predetermined standard of living post-retirement. So these behavioral and psychological processes happen over the long due course of one's life. So for example, planning for retirement is a relevant behavior. So planning again does not happen in one night. It takes a lot of effort to plan towards retirement, and it's a lifelong process in itself. Actually, retirement planning is so intrinsic to retirement readiness or retirement planning that researchers proxy retirement preparedness through retirement planning. So a lot of empirical studies don't even examine retirement preparedness directly. Instead, they opt to examine retirement planning because it is so important for retirement preparedness. So that is one example of a relevant behavior. So a psychological process or psychological factor that is relevant is temporal perspective, also basically one's future orientation towards retirement. So these are just examples of behavior and psychological processes. So moving on to the definition of financial literacy. So again, there are different ways of conceptualizing financial literacy, but there are two main ways that is accomplished. The first way is what is known as subjective financial literacy, that assesses one's subjective assessment of what one thinks their financial literacy levels are. And the second is the more objective measurement of financial literacy, which is the definition I've given her. So it is basically one's ability to comprehend and process economic information. So these economic informations are entails basically interest compounding, inflation, risk diversification. So there are other information as well, but basic financial literacy would encapsulate at the very least these three basic concepts. So if you look at all of finance in general, most of it functions under the core assumptions that financiers at least understand these three basic concepts. And we need these three concepts to make informed financial decisions, although there are other concepts that we need to know. At the very least, this is the very foundation, these three concepts in itself. So any definition of financial literacy, doesn't matter how it's operationalized or conceptualized, it's all for the purpose of attaining financial well-being or financial freedom, in other words. So moving on to the relevance again. So I just want to provide a theoretical perspective of why or how financial literacy contributes to retirement preparedness. To understand that, we need to know a standard economic model, which is called the life cycle hypothesis. So this graph or figure over here depicts the life cycle hypothesis. So LCH is basically postulates that people, when they're earning a lot, when there's high income, people tend to save more, they tend to consume more than they are basically earning, so that there are savings, and then those savings can be utilized during times when one's income is low. So that period is basically retirement period, or the period right before one accomplishes their tertiary education. That's where this saving occurs. So in the graph I've shown where the saving occurs. So that's typically after retirement. So that could be 60 or 65 years later. So that is where the savings are then utilized. So the purpose of LCH postulates that individuals tend to smooth their consumption throughout their life cycle. And this saving is a tool or a means to accomplish that, basically. So consumption smoothing, in turn, is dependent upon three or more factors. So the three concepts that it is dependent upon is consumer preferences. So consumer preferences could vary. Everyone has different risk appetite and so forth. And it also depends on the economic environment in itself, such as the prevalent inflation rate or the interest rate in itself. And also consumption smoothing depends on social safety net benefits. For example, pension income. How good is the pension income in itself? So for consumption smoothing to happen, individuals must be able to plan their savings accordingly so that they can just save in times when it is needed. And they must have the capacity to undertake complex economic calculations, because without the three main core ideas or economic information that I mentioned before, interest compounding, inflation rate understanding, and risk diversification, it wouldn't be possible to save as efficiently and not efficiently accomplish consumption smoothing. And so those three concepts are important. And finally, individuals must have some degree of expertise to deal with financial markets. And these all happen in the face of complex financial products, such as student loans, mortgages, and so forth. So if one does not understand what a mortgage is, it will be very hard to smooth their consumption over their life cycle. And that's why it's important to know how these complex financial products function at the very least, or have a basic understanding of it. So intuitively speaking, we can see that financial literacy is important for consumption smoothing then, because it equips one with the essential information that that one needs to deal with these complex financial products. So that then contributes to consumption smoothing, which basically means that you have adequate savings during your retirement then. So that is how, theoretically speaking, at the very least, financial literacy contributes to retirement preparedness. So, in reality, however, there are a lot of limitations of financial literacy, but I've listed three of the main limitations, and these limitations have actually emerged from very robust findings in literature in itself. So, the first limitation is that the effect of financial literacy in itself decays over time. Actually, there was this meta-analysis conducted. So meta-analysis is basically an aggregation of already established findings. So in a meta-analysis seeks to aggregate those findings to reach to a conclusion. So there was this meta-analysis conducted that found that all else equal, the effect of financial literacy on financial behavior basically becomes negligible 20 months post acquisition or intervention. So the intervention could be acquiring a financial degree in itself. So even if you ask me if I remember the core tenets of financial literacy education that I have, even I will have to revise some of the concepts, the very basic concepts. So they do get lost over time. But I must at least give a caveat about this finding. While the authors found that the effect financial literacy over financial behavior decays over time, there's quite a bit of finding from neuropsychology to indicate that our intelligence is segregated into two main aspects. One is fluid intelligence and one is crystallized intelligence. So as people age, the crystallized intelligence actually starts peaking at old age, which basically means that any financial education that is acquired peaks at late 60s or 70s, in fact. But the effect of financial literacy decays on financial behavior because fluid intelligence decreases over time. The ability to comprehend novel situations decreases over time. So as new financial products are introduced with increasing complexity, although financial education is over there, one has financial education, but the ability to comprehend that complexity of financial products then decreases. So I speculate that is why the effect of financial literacy on behavior decays over time. It's not that the level of education decreases, it's that the effect depletes over time. So the second limitation is the significant costs associated with acquiring financial literacy. So in Malaysia, that can range anywhere to 9% of a household income. And actually acquiring a financial degree in itself could be more expensive. This does not mean that financial literacy should not be. Sorry, it means that financial literacy should be acquired. It's just the effect decays over time. So one has to revise concepts or at the very least keep participating in financial markets to keep up with the complexity. So that is technically speaking a second limitation. And the third limitation is that behavioral change does not naturally follow from just having financial literacy knowledge. There's more to it. You need financial literacy, but you need more than financial literacy, which I will deliberate upon. Sorry, is it okay if everyone please mutes their mic because there's some disturbance coming in? Thank you. So the third limitation is that financial literacy explains only a 0.1% variance in financial behavior during those 20 months in itself, which variance basically means change. So 0.1% change, a change, 1 unit change in financial literacy results in a 0.1% change in financial behavior. Again, I've simplified this variance concept, but fundamentally that's what it means. So what is behavioral economics and why do we even need to apply it to retirement preparedness? So the underlying assumptions of traditional economic models, such as life cycle hypothesis that I just presented, are unrealistic. It generally does not hold in the real world. It's something that we learn in textbooks, but in the real world, it's a bit different. So for example, the concept of Homo economicus or economic man, that is what is portrayed in neoclassical traditional economic models that humans have consistent and stable preferences. They are rational and self-interested agents. So in the real world, we know that humans are in fact not rational. We are confounded by our emotions. We are confounded by self-control problems. We are confounded by all these things. So humans are not rational in every respect of the word, but LCH postulates that humans are rational. So secondly, LCH also postulates that individuals have well-defined preferences. In fact, that at each moment of time, we can choose a particular preference. But in the real world, that does not happen. Preferences can change as new information comes to light, and preferences can change the way that choices are presented to us. So actually, one of the robust findings from behavioral economics is what's known as framing effects. That if we are, like, for example, glass half empty, half full, it changes, alters our preferences, the way that a particular choice is presented to us without changing their values in itself. So, for example, if you go to the grocery store and you're buying hand sanitizers or you're buying shampoo, hand soap or something, we often see it written as kills 99% germs. We never see it written as does not kill 1% germs, although both choices are exactly the same. But this is what's known as a framing effect, that marketers frame it as kills 99% bacteria or germs. So that changes our preferences then, and we tend to buy those products. So our preferences are not well defined, and we do not basically maximize our utility to the best of our abilities, or value. We do not seek value to the best of our abilities in every choice that we make. Again, because we are confounded by our emotions and all the things that make us human. So behavioral economics merges the fields of economics and psychology to provide a more realistic understanding of choice behavior. So when I say choice behavior, I mean volitional choice, or choice that is directly under our will, that we can execute in ourselves. So instead, behavioral economics says that individuals are boundedly rational. In other words, we have limited information, we have limited cognitive abilities, and we are bounded by time constraints, all of which are true. We don't have infinite capacity to sit down and make one decision. We make a decision and we move on basically to the next one. So we are bounded as humans by these three limitations. So because of these three limitations, we do not maximize in the face of complexity, or we do not optimize in the face of complexity. Instead, we adopt what is known as heuristics, or rules of thumb, to help us facilitate our decision making. And this in turn eases our cognitive load as well. So again, the purpose of utilizing mental shortcuts, or heuristics as it's called, is to ease the load that's in our brain when we're faced with complex amount of information. And this speeds up our decision making as well. So for example, I'll give you an example of heuristics. In the real world, humans use intuition. We don't precisely measure the amount of sugar we put in our coffee to the very grain. We don't go in a lab and do that. We just make rough estimations because we have limited time. So that is us using heuristics, or mental rules of thumb, or mental shortcuts, basically. Another example of a heuristic is an educated guess. So when we go out, we don't know who might be infected by COVID-19, or who might be asymptomatic for that case. So we keep a social distance because we have limited information just to be safe. So that again is the use of heuristic, or a shortcut or mental rule of thumb that we have in our minds. And we conform to norms, social norms. For example, we don't multitask when we're driving, we obey traffic rules because we have limited cognitive capacity to do so many tasks. And when we're driving, we don't listen to the loud music, we don't talk to the side passenger, we're not over our phone all at the same time. So we conform to the norm because our brains cannot process so much information. So conforming to the norm, in this case, obeying the traffic rule, is a heuristic, or is a mental shortcut that speeds up our decision-making process in turn. So similarly, individuals use heuristics to make many retirement-related decisions. Again, the use of heuristics or mental shortcuts is applicable to retirement-related decisions because we prepare for retirement in the real world, where we are confounded by so many things that make us very human. Again, that comes to our cognitive limitations, that comes to the fact that we have limited time, and so forth, basically. And again, retirement related decisions are very complex. For example, computing one's ideal personal savings rate. Actually, Richard Taylor, considered the father of behavioral economics, who won the Nobel Prize, he himself says that even amongst economists, they very seldom calculate their optimal savings rate because it is so hard to do. Instead, they employ heuristics themselves. So for example, computing one's saving could be 10%, 20%, So this is a heuristic utilizing variance of 10%, 5%, and so forth. But the use of these heuristics can also lead to biases. For example, conforming to a particular norm can lead to a bias when the norm is represents a level of savings rate that is below one's requirement. So there was a study conducted by researchers from the London School of Economics. They found that UK born grandchildren of immigrants tend to conform to the norm of savings behavior of their grandparents' country of origin, even though they live under different economic conditions. So one may postulate that they do this because it is very hard to compute one's ideal savings rate. So they just anchor on to their grandparents' country savings rate over there. So this, in this case, can lead to a bias because conformity to a norm in this case would benefit a select few people, particularly when there's disparity, significant disparity in the socioeconomic status of the country of origin. But all this is fine and said, policymakers at the same time, they can leverage upon our tendency to use heuristics and nudge us to make better retirement preparedness and related decisions as well. So this, our tendency to use mental shortcuts for retirement related decisions can also be a powerful tool to nudge us to make better choices. So for example, actually this is done actively in the UK, US, Australia. They actually have government units called nudge units or behavioral intervention teams that seek to capitalize upon this tendency of humans to make best, to nudge their pre-retirees towards better retirement preparedness. So for example, in the US, there's evidence that simply citing peer information of what one's peer does in respect to savings can nudge people to increase their savings in emails, just citing peer information. And there have been a lot of calculations done or in studies done in this respect, and they found that savings actually increased by $11,500 per person by simply citing peer information because we conform to what our peers do. We use that here as a heuristic. So such interventions are not mandates, and they preserve recipients' freedom of choice. Like if I read in an email that my peers are saving this much, it's up to me if I want to increase my savings or not. So this is basically conforming to what's known as libertarian paternalism, is that these preserve our own choices as well, and they do not present any economic incentives, and they're very cost effective than these sort of interventions. So these are the advantages of leveraging upon our tendency to use heuristics. So one research actually found out that the effect of heuristics, such interventions, for example, citing peer information in emails, the effect on pre-retiree savings can last up to 20 years. And this study was done in the Swedish retirement market. Now compare this to financial literacy, that studies have found that the effect decays over time and then it stays for a maximum of 20 months. And it seems that nudges, these leveraging upon heuristic, seem like a very cost-effective way of doing so. So it's surprising to note that it is not commonly done in the retirement market in itself. So why did we apply behavioral insights to the Malaysian retirement market to begin with? So considering the state of the Malaysian retirement market, so the average EPF savings is well below the 228,000 government basically recommended threshold. Males and females both alike save very little in Malaysia compared to the 228,000 target. Considering the status of financial assets, most Malaysians, actually 50% or more, own no financial assets whatsoever, given that their EPF savings are already considered to be low. And given that Malaysians, 90% or more, have zero personal savings. So this actually begs the question, then how do pre-retirees even survive during retirement? Well, as it turns out that it is a continuous cycle in which it is the children who support their parents, and that goes on to affect their retirement preparedness, and so forth. Their children support their children. So it is this dependency, constant dependency cycle, and this has implications for quality of life as well. Considering financial literacy levels in Malaysia, almost less than 50% of Malaysians are financially literate. So that is actually, though it is above a lot of countries, but compared to OECD countries, it still ranks below that then. So there have been quite a few government initiatives to boost retirement preparedness in Malaysia. So I've just listed a few notable ones. One was increasing the retirement age from 55 to 60 so that people can save more and that the saving can occur over a shorter period amount of time. Providing tax relief for EPF members, increasing retirement income for those who earn 5,000 and below. And actually, the most notable one has been the Economic Transformation Plan, ETP. So the core focus of this was on financial literacy, finding ways to boost financial literacy of pre-retirees. And there are studies upcoming that are going to talk about the efficacy of ETP. But despite these efforts, there's still some evidence to indicate that if the current status quo continues of dependency on children for retirement preparedness, the savings deficit will increase to 100 billion by 2050 in Malaysia. And this is expected to be fulfilled by the government as an expenditure, then that could be utilized elsewhere. So there is, at the very least, some room for improvement of retirement preparedness. Let's just put it in an easier way, I guess. So our moving on to our research, these were the reasons we sought to include behavioral insights that maybe there might be something to it. Other countries have done it, so maybe Malaysia can do it. But what did we find exactly? So this is one of the slides that's a bit more clustered, but I'll explain this. So our first study was focused on unfolding the mechanisms of why does financial literacy even boost retirement preparedness to begin with. So in unlocking those mechanisms, we sought to identify contributor variables. And we thought that if we identify those variables, we can directly design interventions that boost those particular variables that will in turn increase retirement preparedness. So we hypothesized that financial literacy leads to better retirement preparedness because it increases pre-retirees' financial self-efficacy and it increases their personal savings behavior as well. So let me just deliberate upon what is financial self-efficacy. So in behavioral psychology, financial self-efficacy refers to one's sense of self-agency. So self-agency is basically a subjective feeling that one is the author of their own behavior, that one can do whatever task that they want to accomplish, that they have the capacity to do that. So this, in terms of financial self-efficacy, refers to one's ability to accomplish financial tasks, subjective feeling that I can accomplish this and I can cope up with financial challenges. So this feeling, intrinsic feeling, is known as financial self-efficacy. So what we found was that people who have higher financial literacy tend to have higher financial self-efficacy, and they then exhibit greater personal savings behavior. Now, personal savings behavior is basically a choice behavior. It's not mandated. It's not given by law that we have to increase our personal savings behavior. So it's done under our own choice. So those who have higher financial self-efficacy exert the necessary efforts to boost their personal savings behavior, which then leads on to greater retirement preparedness. So this is what's known as a serial mediation model. Actually, it's okay if you don't understand the model, but it's the findings that are more important in itself. So going a bit deeper, we also found that those who have higher financial literacy have higher financial self-efficacy, and they then perceive their retirement preparedness to be low. So how we operationalized retirement preparedness was we asked individuals, what do you think your level of retirement preparedness is, as opposed to objectively measuring it. So the advantage of doing this was that those who perceive their financial self-efficacy to be high, they perceive their retirement preparedness to be low. And we found, or we speculate, that this is because it serves as an intrinsic form of motivation then for them to better prepare for retirement. And actually, that turned out to be true because they then exert the necessary efforts to boost their personal savings. So again, this is not exactly a causal model that explains cause and effect, but this model allowed us to observe at least the current status quo as it is given, and we can identify cause and effect pathways through the serial mediation model. Next, we focused in our second study, we focused on financial self-efficacy. Once we found out that it is important to deliver financial education, but we need to design interventions that focus on financial self-efficacy and personal savings behavior. So in our second study, we then focused on financial self-efficacy. Basically, how can we boost financial self-efficacy? So in our second study, we meta-analyzed existing studies. Basically, we accrued existing studies, empirical studies, to find out how can we increase financial self-efficacy. In doing so, we sought to examine the effect or the association between financial literacy and financial self-efficacy. And what we found, again, you don't need to exactly understand this equation. I just presented it for all the academics present at this webinar. It might be insightful for them. So we derived a 3-level meta-analytical model, and we found that the nature or how financial literacy is conceptualized moderates this relationship basically between financial literacy and financial self-efficacy. What this basically means is that financial literacy has a medium and significant association with financial self-efficacy, and that subjective financial literacy is a better predictor of financial self-efficacy than objective financial literacy. So basically, the implication of this is that instilling confidence in individuals' financial ability, as opposed to delivering vigorous financial education programs, is a better way for fostering financial self-efficacy. So this is one way that we found out that how financial self-efficacy can be boosted is by delivering financial education, but at the same time instilling confidence that yes, you do have the ability to make good financial choices. So in our third study, we then focused on how do we boost personal savings behavior, because all these contribute towards retirement preparedness. And well, we set up an experiment, which was a survey-based experiment. And how can we nudge individuals to form higher perception of their ideal personal savings rate, one that is above a given norm? Now, the example that I presented, it is before about the researchers in LSE who found that UK-born immigrants tend to mimic the savings behavior of their grandparents' country of origin. In this case, the norm could be underrepresented, in fact. So you want a personal savings rate that is above the norm just to be safe, because otherwise the norm would benefit a few people only. So what we found, we set up an experiment for this in which we randomly assigned participants to 3 different conditions. We provided peer information to them. So in one of the conditions, we told them that it is believed that on average, some Malaysian employees save 10% of their monthly salary as personal savings for retirement. So this 10% figure came from existing reports and empirical studies that actually did say that some pre-retirees do save 10%. In another group, we provided the intervention in the form of peer information in which we said some Malaysian employees save 30% as opposed to the 10%. Again, this was based on existing reports and empirical studies that found that some people do, in fact, save 30%. And what we found was that in the peer 10 condition, who were provided the 10% value, they did conform to the norm, the peer information that we provided. So they lowered their expectation or perception of their ideal savings rate towards the anchor that we provided them. But in the condition in which we provided the 30% peer savings intervention, it turns out that they didn't conform to the norm. Instead, they took a position opposite to the norm. So this is basically called what's known as a boomerang effect, taking a position opposite to that of the norm. In both cases, we found that individuals were in fact susceptible to peer information. So there seems to be some potential in peer information in basically self-directing the personal savings behavior of pre-retirees in Malaysia. So there is some scope for that. At least that is what our study found. Although the intervention in itself was not 100% successful, but this was an important implication that came out of our findings. So to conclude, our research, what it found is that financial literacy does promote retirement preparedness, but then again, given the it has limitations, 3 of which are already mentioned in the real world. It is costly to acquire financial literacy. So one must acquire, at the very least, one must have basic financial literacy, but that does not mean that it stops over there. There are other mechanisms involved, and our study basically found that financial self-efficacy is basically important as well, instilling confidence in individuals. Financial capacity is very important as well. So that is what we found. Our second conclusion, which moves me to us towards our second conclusion, that behavioral interventions can, in fact, improve retirement preparedness in Malaysia. So it all comes down to nuancing guiding practices and designing interventions appropriately and doing more research to finding out what sort of behavioral interventions can be applied in the Malaysian retirement market. All we did was just provide a very preliminary sort of intervention just to see that if peer retirees are even susceptible to peer information in the Malaysian retirement market. And in fact, we did find that they are susceptible. So there have been a lot of studies that have been conducted in this regard, but those are mostly outside of Malaysia. So there is another study that our study does conform to. In the US, they found very similar findings that financial people tend to have boomerang effects above a certain threshold of peer information. So it all comes down to designing interventions accordingly. But for that, there is more research that is needed, basically. So, yep, that sums up the presentation, the webinar in itself. Thank you so much. So I'm actually open for questions. We have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions and answers. So if anyone has any questions, I guess now would be the time to start. Please unmute your mic and ask me as many questions as you want to. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Okay, Hassan, may I ask? And though I'm from organizing committee, but it's an interested topic. So,
sure, Dr. Mohsen, go ahead.
Quick question: can you elaborate a little bit on the meta-analysis you conducted? Is
Sure.
regression, like you said, we meta-analyzed the association between financial
Okay.
literacy and efficacy. Is it a sort of regression, and what were the data points, and how did you get that?
Sure. So that's a good question, Dr. Mohsen. So what we did was utilize meta regression. So there are actually different ways of doing meta-analysis. So technically there are two ways. One is by using what's known as analog to the one-way ANOVA, and the other is meta regression. So we use meta regression because it saves data points. And ANOVA, you need to basically categorize variables, right? So you have to categorize a certain threshold, but in meta regression, you can just put in the data points as they are given. So that is one of the advantages of utilizing meta regression. So there are certain assumptions of a meta analysis that there cannot be dependency between studies. So if you are extracting an effect size from one study, you cannot extract multiple effect size from one study, sorry, because there tends to be a dependency between studies. So you need to have only one effect size per study. So meta regression, you can have multiple effect size extracted from a study, and then you nest them in what's known as a 3-level meta-analytical model. You tell the model basically that I have multiple effect size from one study. So that accrues it all together. So that basically saves or preserves one of the assumptions of meta-analysis, which is dependency. So this is basically what's known as meta-regression. So in this, what we found was that conceptualization of financial literacy, which is a steady level characteristic, moderates the association between financial literacy and financial self-efficacy. What this basically means that the heterogeneity in the effect sizes between different studies is explained or is dependent upon how financial literacy was conceptualized in each of these studies. So those studies that conceptualized financial literacy as being subjective in nature, they had a better association, or sorry, a stronger association with financial self-efficacy as compared to studies that had utilized objective measures of financial literacy. So what this basically means is that objective subjective financial literacy is a better predictor of financial self-efficacy. So if you go at the very definition of what subjective financial literacy it is basically one's confidence in their level of financial literacy. Basically, our study found, the meta-analysis found that having greater confidence in one's ability of financial literacy, as opposed to having actual financial literacy knowledge, turns out to be a better predictor of financial self-efficacy. So that basically means that it fosters more financial self-efficacy. Of course, for this to happen, there needs to be a certain basic level of financial literacy. Again, no amount of self-appraisal or confidence can ever overtake one's level of financial literacy. You do need financial literacy. At the very least, the three basic concepts that I mentioned about interest compounding, risk diversification, and inflation. These are very important concepts. But anything above that, you do need more things such as financial self-efficacy then. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and how many data points were there? One second, quickly, could you also, like for future research, maybe could you also do some threshold analysis that out of like, because objective financial literacy, as you have said, without having real knowledge, doesn't matter how you personally think. What I'm saying is, could there be a threshold level of objective financial literacy which you must have? So like I'm just because I'm the type of, I'm purely talking from econometric point of view. So if there is a possibility maybe in future that could add some value. And how many data points were there?
That's a very good point, actually. That will make a really interesting study too. So for the data points, we had 8 studies that we could find from Scopus that were Scopus indexed. Actually, in a meta-analysis, you're technically supposed to include studies that are unpublished as well. But we could not find unpublished studies in this case. So we included the ones that were Scopus indexed. So we found 8 studies, and the total sample size of our finding was based on over 32,000 samples. So this is one of the advantages of meta-analysis, is that the conclusions that are reached in a meta-analysis tend to be more precise and robust compared to any single included study, because their standard errors tend to be bigger. In a meta-analysis, you shorten or reduce that standard error. But the point that you raised, is there a certain threshold above which, if I understand correctly, what you said is that at what level or threshold of financial literacy does the effect start decaying, in other words, I suppose. But that is a good point. But for that, you would need existing studies that have examined that. And I can't really think of studies that have. There might have been, but on top of my mind, I can't really think how do we exactly find that threshold. One way would be to conceptualize how studies have conceptualized financial literacy, and that is what we did. I guess going forward, one way would be to see how many, the variation in objective financial literacy in itself. So studies that have used 3 measures to assess financial literacy, studies that have used 5 measures, 8 measures. So I think that would be the way forward, more or less, to see that basic financial literacy, intermediate financial literacy, or advanced financial literacy. So maybe a meta-analysis could conceptualize it, or categorize it into these 3 categories and see if this categorization moderates this association. I guess that would be one way of doing it. But this would make a really good study, the point that you highlighted.
Thank you, Assam. And there are a couple of more questions in that.
Sure. Let me just. Actually, Dr. Mohsen, could you please help me out? And it would be helpful if you could just read the questions, because I can stay on my slide as well, if that is possible.
Okay, so one question is, what is the age group of your sample?
Oh, that's a good question. So these studies that we conducted, I mean, other than the meta-analysis, the 2 studies that we conducted, the study, the serial multiple mediation one, and this study, the experiment that we designed. So this was based on pre-retirees who were aged 30 to 60, between this age limit, because we found out a report or a comprehensive study that basically said that Malaysian pre-retirees need to start preparing from 30 years of age. So that was a report by HSBC Malaysia or HSBC UK, one of these. So in their report, it was based on a very large sample size, and they wanted to know descriptively what the Malaysians think about their retirement security. And a very large number, actually a majority of them, said that we should have, or we should start preparing when you're 30 years old. So given that people themselves perceive that we need to start preparing from 30, shows that they're open to interventions, or they're open to strategies to start preparing for retirement. That's why we set the cutoff period at 30 years of age. Actually, it could be below that as well. But for this reason, we set it off. We didn't want to be random about it. We wanted it to be based on something systematic. Oh, I hope that answers the question. Dr. Mohsen, are there more questions?
Dr. Hassan, can I question, please?
Yes,
I
please.
would like, could you please elaborate on the reason for the lack of subsequent behavior change? You did mention that there was subsequent behavior change. Um, you said it does not naturally follow. Now, what is the reason, or what are the reasons for this kind of like lack of subsequent behavioral change in the financial behavior among senior citizens, especially across countries? Now, can this be due to the lack of financial literacy, or could this be rooted in some cultural beliefs, like the fear of global market instability? Or do you think that there may be other factors at play? I would like to hear your views regarding this. Thank you.
Actually, thank you so much for that question. That question itself was the answer, and that was very insightful. So I'm glad you asked that. So when I say subsequent behavioral change does not naturally follow, so let's just speak from it from an intuitive perspective. Imagine someone who has let's make it a controlled condition as an experiment. Let's make this a bit more fun. So imagine someone who has stayed in the laboratory for all of his life, has never been outside the lab, but that person has a PhD in finance. So you see, that person knows the very concepts of financial literacy, knows it to the core, in fact. And just because one knows something does not necessarily mean one executes the necessary actions that will accomplish the desired behaviors. So you need to execute what you know as well. You need to execute your financial literacy as well. And in fact, this is what the serial multiple mediation model showed, that financial literacy is executed through one's financial self-efficacy appraisal. So if one is confounded by self-doubts that I cannot accomplish this behavior, a person will not undertake that behavior then. So that is where the concept of self-efficacy, social cognition theory comes into play. That for behavioral change to follow, one must also execute that action. And for one to execute that action, they must think that that behavior is in their reach, that they have the ability to accomplish that. So in other words, one must also have confidence, one must also have self-efficacy, and one must also believe in themselves that yes, I can attain this, I can do this. So that is also important because knowledge needs execution as well. So usually it is that execution part that is less emphasized, I would say so, but that also plays an important part. So that is a mediator in the relationship between financial literacy and financial behavior. Now, you were absolutely right when you said that does it come down to cultural aspects as well? It absolutely does come down to that. And in fact, it's that financial self-efficacy. If everyone has that self-agency, everyone does have financial self-efficacy. It's just that if we don't appraise it, it differs by cultures then also. In some cultures, financial self-efficacy is not fostered. So particularly in countries where financial inclusion is low, or countries where the complexity of or depth of financial markets is not so much, you would not expect over there individuals would foster this confidence in them that I can accomplish financial tasks. So countries that are tend to be more developed, I would say so, financially speaking at least, over there you would expect people to have greater confidence in their financial abilities. In other words, more financial self-efficacy, because they perpetually deal with complex financial products. And one of the sources of financial self-efficacy is past experience or mastery experience. So the more successful you are in a particular financial task, that in itself will breed greater financial self-efficacy, that I've done this before, I know I can do it again. Another way to foster financial self-efficacy is through vicarious experience. This is very similar to observational learning, that seeing that your similar others have accomplished a particular financial task, so I can also do it then. So again, this comes to the cultural aspect, relates to what you were saying earlier. So another way to foster financial self-efficacy is through one's own physiological states. Like for example, if I'm doing a task that is I perceive to be very difficult, it will manifest physiologically in me. My heart rate will start pounding, I'll start sweating. So that in turn gives a feedback to me that no, maybe I cannot accomplish this task. But someone who has a stable physiological state, that, oh, I have done this task before, so his heart would be beating probably less compared to me in that case. I mean, heartbeat, maybe that person wouldn't be start sweating and wouldn't sweat out completely that, that I can do this task maybe. So that gives another feedback, and that fosters financial self-efficacy as well. So again, it does come back to the cultural aspect. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Or comments, anything?
There are no more questions in the chat.
Right. So I think we can move on to the organizers actually wanted to take a picture of all the participants. So I think we can move on to that right now. So I'm just gonna unshare this so that we can move on to the picture session.
Please, everyone, can you please switch on your cameras?
Please switch on your cameras, everyone. I see there are a few people who haven't switched their cameras on. I guess maybe not everyone wants to be in the picture, but that's fine, whoever wants to be. Right.
Yeah, I'm gonna take now. So 1, 2, 3. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar.
Yeah.